Are in the world. Thank you for joining me for this week's edition of the SMIE Consulting Midweek Roundup. I'm your host, Marty Bennett, and today on the Roundup, we're going to be answering 3 questions we've been hearing from international educators over the last 7 days. Before we begin, I also want to give my sincere thanks and gratitude to all of you who have reached out over the last 2 weeks since the December 6th shooting on the UNLV campus. Our campus is still reeling. It's the darkest day in our campus's history, but we're resilient. We are Rebel Nation, and we are ready to rebuild stronger and come back together after we grieve as a community and become a more unified campus community as a result of the tragedy that unfolded on December 6th. So thank you again for everybody who's reached out in the past few days. Really appreciate your messages. They really help sustain me as a remote employee, not being on the college campus, not being able to interact with my colleagues directly and help them grieve. Your messages have really been a real important piece of my being able to deal with this tragedy. So thank you so much for everything that you've done. So let's get right into it with this week's edition of the Midweek Roundup. As we do each week, for those that are new to the Roundup, we take a look at the major themes that have developed in the past week as they relate to different news stories impacting social media, international education, both in the United States and globally, that might help us better understand the landscape in which we operate as international educators. We do this each week first by publishing a newsletter on Monday. It's called All the SMIE News Fit to Share, and that can be found, an archive of all the past editions can be found on our smieconsulting.org website /subscribe, and you'll be able to subscribe to that. I'll drop the links to all of those in the chat, as well as an email that allows you to get the email version of that newsletter delivered to your inbox every Monday morning at 9 a.m. Eastern. We also have a LinkedIn version of that newsletter that for those of you who prefer to get your international ed news that way on that professional social network that we all know and love. Between the two, email and LinkedIn, we have over 1,600 subscribers now to the newsletter, All the SMIE News Fit to Share. And in case you were wondering, that SMIE is part of the company name. It's Social Media and International Education Consulting. So we are proud to present those newsletters free of charge to those of you who wish to kind of get an encapsulated version of my hot takes on all the major themes that we see develop each week in social media news, international education news, both at home and abroad. So feel free to do that on our website. Subscribe on LinkedIn as well. Just search for All the SMIE News Fit to Share. You'll be able to find that newsletter and subscribe that way. But let's get right into our first question of the day. And it is a one that we've been discussing, and it relates to China. That has up until this past fall been the number one source of international students in the United States and several other countries in recent years, since probably mid-noughties. But we've seen that trend reversed, and Chinese student numbers had been declining since probably 2016-17. And certainly during the pandemic took a bigger hit. Many institutions that had relied on that gravy train of Chinese undergraduates to sustain them financially and otherwise internationally have seen big drop-offs. A lot of them for over 4 or 5 years have been looking for ways to try and minimize the decline that they saw with limited success. Certainly the pandemic didn't help anyone in that regard. But the question of, is China being overly politicized by the United States? And you can certainly see within the country, there are some concerns that are very well founded in terms of China's reach into its own society, into its own companies that operate outside of China, and the rules that they must follow as Chinese companies in terms of data access for the Chinese Communist Party. We've talked about all those over the years, and we've seen this with TikTok, and we saw during the Trump administration there was introduction of the China Initiative that limited and examined and tried to ferret out what they thought were a huge spy network of Chinese scientists and students that had come to the United States to spy on the United States, to take back intellectual property and that type of thing back to China, and have enhanced China's reputation in terms of the scientific knowledge that they have broken through with in the past few years. That was potentially on the backs of stolen knowledge. But we're not going to cover that piece today. We're talking about the politicization of China as it impacts the versions of that are from certain parts of the political landscape in the United States, and certainly we don't need to go over who those are. But certainly the far-right elements of the Republican Party have identified China as a number one threat. There are those in the Democratic Party that also see China as our largest threat globally. But those in the international education space, we always know and advocate for engagement rather than disengagement when it comes to potential enemies abroad. We help educate scholars and students from Iran, from Venezuela, from China, from Russia in the past, where there have been huge numbers, governments that we don't agree with on a lot of things, that we have spent time educating their students and then them returning home and becoming successes in their own country. That's always been the goal of the State Department, public diplomacy-wise, improve mutual understanding. But politics gets in the way of a lot of things these days, and it's a sad state of affairs for our country. We see that happening seen that happening for the last 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 years with world events that where political parties decide to massage those events into their own worldview and then have it negatively impact what we do policy-wise in the United States. So we've seen that over the years, and China has certainly been a target from the previous administration. Not so much a target now. We had the whole spy balloon fiasco last year, and that has had some legs, or earlier this year even. And that has had some legs in terms of its impact on politics and in terms of how we view, the general public views China. And when the news is always negative about a country, the general perception is among most Americans is it also tends to turn negative. So that's part of the news cycle. That's part of how Americans get their information. Social media certainly doesn't help, and just paints that picture of the us versus them kind of scenario that has been around for since time immemorial. But in terms of is it being overly politicized, we see certain examples of that. In certain states in the United States. We've seen that with the whole TikTok issue. Certain states, particularly heavy red states, banned TikTok for government officials and even institutions in their states. We've seen now in Florida, there has been legislation that was passed that has identified countries of concern. There's a list of 7 of those countries that this law that is being seen by most academics in public institutions in Florida as having a real chilling effect on potentially being able to attract students that might be coming from these countries of concern, and China is chief amongst those. The list of countries will sound fairly familiar. China. Russia has been included in the last couple of years. Iran, North Korea, Cuba, Venezuela, Syria. What many of us would consider outside of China and Russia. Russia probably is falling into this category now, rogue states, or at very least unfriendly states to the United States. The actual measure that passed, China is obviously, and then Iran, then Russia probably, and Venezuela are the 3 in that list. 4 in that list that are probably the most have the most volume in terms of students, scholars in the United States. But the measure that passed in the spring has gone into effect now, restricts public universities and colleges from, quote unquote, accepting grants from or participating in partnerships or agreements. Now, we've certainly had experienced this at UNLV. We're not in a state that has this kind of law, but we had an institution in Florida approach us earlier this year that was interested in us taking over their program. I'm not going to name the name of the program, but that they had with a partner institution in China. They had been operating for 20 years. That they were potentially looking at not wanting to lose momentum with that program, at least have that relationship continue with us related to one of our programs. So that there is a very real consequence of this law that passed in the spring, that now institutions that have existing partnerships are having to rethink what those look like. You also have the questions being raised on campuses now. Well, what does this mean about hiring graduate assistants? Is that a partnership? Is that an agreement? It's an agreement between the Chinese national and a university, but the faculty at the public institutions in Florida are raising some red flags here. Is like, this is significantly going to impact our ability to enroll Chinese students, which make up a significant portion of their graduate student populations at these large public institutions. What is the actual damage going to be? It's a little bit hard to say right now, but of those seven countries that are on that list, the largest source of international students in Florida's public institutions are science, technology, engineering, math, are from China. So it's really going to causing some political waves, obviously, and impacts on educational and public institutions in the state of Florida. So it's we're not. I mean, there's no definitive answers, but the image kind of goes back to what happened during the Trump administration. With the day after he was inaugurated, he launched the what became known as the Muslim travel bans to 7 countries, and included a couple of these also on that list, North Korea, Iran, that type of thing. But that caused a knock-on effect, that because it was seen as a Muslim ban, and even though it was targeting mostly rogue Muslim states, that Yemen, Syria, that type of thing, it had an impact far beyond those states that were targets of the travel ban, to include many Muslim majority countries that saw that as a threat and an unwelcome sign for them to come to the United States. Many still did, but it dissuaded a number of students from coming, because the government was saying, because you're from these certain Muslim countries, you're not welcome here. The reality is the law did have carve-outs for students to be legitimate visa recipients to be able to come to the United States, but the damage was done with the tone that was set by the politics of the conversation and how it was presented and how it was interpreted by news media across the world. So the same issue now is facing, in a microcosm of the United States, within Florida, where the law that was recently passed is now worrying students who might have thought about coming to Florida to one of these public institutions, to think that they are going to be discriminated against if they do come to the state. So there's some real issues, longer term issues, that this Florida law will have potentially on recruitment of international students from China. So that's one side of the coin. The positive side of the China debate right now is that they had certainly a troubled, and they're experiencing it right now, a post-pandemic economy downturn, or decrease in growth, or that type, however you want to pose it. China has had a rough re-entry into the world. They only just reopened to the world in January. Flights have still not resumed to full capacity from the West to China. So there was agreements when Biden and Xi met in California last month, that there would be increases in the number of flights by this summer. We hope, on university campuses, we're certainly holding our breath, making sure that happens, because that will allow more students to come in the fall. What we are also seeing from folks on the ground who have been in China for years, who have got their fingers on the pulse of what's going on, there certainly seem to be some trends in China that are portending an increase again in enrollments, that for those that might be looking abroad in the next year or two or more. And that has to do, our friends at Sunrise International, David Weeks and his colleague Gavin Newsom-Tanner have done a number of presentations recently, just did a webinar on 6 key trends in China that will shape student recruitment. And in that webinar, they highlighted the increases in international school enrollments in China, and that could help feed the future study abroad markets. There are families in China there's a feeling of social malaise, according to the article, and that means that there's low economic confidence and reduced consumer spending, and that's families, again, saving to send their kids abroad. Will they all come to the United States? No, of course not. China is a much more diverse landscape nowadays in terms of where they choose to go. They have many more options than they did 10, 15 years ago in terms of active countries recruiting in that market to try and get their share of the pie. Because we know it's China and India. India and China are the two that will drive every institution's growth plans in international student enrollment in the coming years. There is no other one that's on the radar that's anywhere close to those two. You look at Brazil potentially, you look at Indonesia as a sleeping giant. There's others out there, but for the majority of institutions around the world that are looking to bring in international students, India and China are the key drivers of everything, for half, if not more, of international enrollments on most campuses in the Western world. So, but the signs are somewhat positive in terms of what's coming down the pike in China and whether or not there will be some real opportunities to regain your stronghold in China and to increase your enrollments again from that country. Some are being more successful than others. Some who never had a ground game in China are madly trying to find the ways to get their folks on the ground, either agent partners or university partners or a combination of both, direct recruitment activities. All of these can be important elements or a strong digital strategy as well. So 3 or 4 different elements to a strong China strategy. I know that's a topic for a lot of conference sessions, I'm sure, down the road. But re-engaging with China, I had a colleague just comment on this post about this topic just yesterday, and asked, well, how do you re-engage in China? And really, what it comes down to in most cases, like with many other regions in the world, it's the relationships you have in that country, the relationships with your agent partners, with your university partners, with providers that are doing tours or visits and those type of events, fairs, getting to know them and getting to know how your institution can best take advantage of opportunities in China. And it does require physical presence, really, if you're going to make that happen to any significant degree. And that's something we're doing at UNLV. We now have one of our faculty members who's the China initiatives specialist and coordinator, if you will, and following up on our trip that we did there in June to China, where we met with 4 new partner universities, some really fantastic institutions. And developing strategies to help build enrollments out of that is ongoing, and it's multifaceted, multi-layered. But you need to be in the country to have a chance of getting those students back. So, yes, it's being overly politicized, China is, by the United States, but we break down those barriers when we have a relationship with Chinese faculty, with Chinese agents, with schools, with all with in-person service providers in that country, and help break down those barriers and show the real life of what your institution can offer to Chinese students. So let's move on to topic number 2, and that is, what challenges will international education face in 2024? This is a topic that I love, and it's always the right time of year at the end of December every year. These reviews of 2023, what's coming in 2024, all of these, is the kind of time to happen. Time when these are really starting to build. And certainly this is our last midweek roundup of the calendar year, 2023. We'll be off next week for some much needed time with family, but we'll resume in 2024. Likely on the 4th, we might be doing a live as I'm traveling out to do some work in Seattle and hopefully on campus the second full week of January. So, where is this topic coming from? ISEF Monitor article related to this topic: the 5 international education trends that will extend into 2024. And I'll run through these first and kind of give the 10,000-foot view and kind of dive into a couple of these. First up, 1, AI moves into the mainstream. And 2, students expect faster responses. 3, study abroad becomes less affordable. 4, a sudden move away from an unrestricted growth mindset. 5, India is now driving global growth in student mobility, and we've talked a bit about that. So let's dive into a couple of these, and I want to talk about the less affordable part. The global financial inflation crisis that's impacting everybody. Certainly, that's nothing new, and yeah, that's going to continue. Might have some brighter spots, but we'll see. But in terms of the two that I would love to focus on here, there's some. If those of you who followed me for a while, you know about our 6 Ps. I talked about this a couple of weeks ago at the AIRC conference, had a session about it. It's going to be a chapter in an upcoming book that some of the folks at AIRC are producing, hopefully sometime in the spring. We talk about the 6 Ps. The first one is perspective. The second is planning. The third is the platforms. The fourth are the partners you choose. The fifth is the personalization strategy you use in terms of your marketing to students and key audiences. And the sixth is having a healthy dose of peers using current students to help recruit future students. So those are the 6 Ps. This ICEF Monitor article really helps encapsulate a lot of what we talk about in the 6 Ps as the kind of foundational principles that you need to have your eye on as you're building strategies and tactics to accommodate for very much a changing dynamic landscape that we have out here. First up is knowing your audience, right? And who your audience is, international students. What do they expect? They expect fast response times. They expect personalized responses. They expect to hear from you within 24 hours. That's 62%. A recent Keystone survey earlier this year said 62% of students expect a response from a university within 24 hours or less. And that's an increase of over 21% over 2022 numbers. So that is a driver for that first one that was talked about, that AI will become more mainstream and helping to reduce the delays in responding to initial inquiries. So how AI can help you do that in chats and automated responses, all those things that can help, AI can help infuse how you respond to these messages. So that's the personalization piece that's so important that we talk about in the 6 Ps. The one I really want to spend a little bit of time on is numbers 4 and 5. And that is a sudden move away from an unrestricted growth mindset. Now, I'm not going to say that's the U.S. mode here. I don't think we're in that. We're moving away from an unrestricted growth mindset because, frankly, most of our institutions, we know that 60% of international students are at less than 600 institutions. In the United States. So there are 4,500 post-secondary institutions in the United States. 60% are attending 600 or so. So that is, we have a high concentration within those 600 or so. But we know that our capacity in the United States, in terms of our entire higher ed population, student population in the U.S., international students are less than 6%, 5.5 or so from the most recent Open Doors numbers. That's the only place where we really get that kind of a data point. But in these other countries, Australia, Canada, UK, we're looking at 25 to 30 to 40% or more on many of their college and university campuses are international students now. Why is that? Because they don't have the number of institutions that we do. In Canada, there are less than 100 universities, post-secondary universities. There are 200 to 300 colleges. These are the vocational colleges, both public and private. So you've got less than a tenth of the total post-secondary institutions north of the border, yet they right now are enrolling 800,000 plus, maybe 900,000 plus international students this year. And they are running into capacity issues and also public perception issues and economic issues, particularly with housing, in terms of availability of housing for all these extra students when there really isn't that built in a lot of places in Canada where there are now institutions like Cape Breton University that are specifically downsizing their populations. That is a sign. We've talked about Canada last week and the week before, UK as well. Australia, Canada, UK are all undergoing significant political pushback on unlimited or unrestricted growth of international students for a variety of reasons, housing being one of them, the impact on health services in the UK, a number of different areas. Net migration in UK and Australia are key issues, and where there's public pushback against that. In general, most publics in these major receiving countries are supportive of international students in their communities and on college campuses, but they've seen such a rise, and the way it gets talked about in the news seems to make it seem like it's a bigger problem than it actually is. But in reality, it is a big problem when it comes to housing and other things. So you see each of these three countries now, Canada introducing their designated institution framework by requiring LOAs be verified before students can go for their study permits, that they've doubled the amount of funding that students have to provide proof of from 10,000 to 20,000 Canadian dollars. You see in Australia, which we're going to talk about in the third question, they have a new migration strategy that has a number of different elements that are going after some of the more suspect colleges that are vocational colleges that are seen as kind of quick entry points into the Australian economy. You see similar things happening in Canada, where the specific rules of this designated institution framework and potential limits on provinces if they don't get their acts together in terms of quality control for those institutions, because there is no national accreditation of the institutions in Canada. It's all done at the provincial level. The stick that they have is, hey, if you want your students to get study permits, you got to follow our rules and make sure that you're providing the right level of service and all the things that the government has identified on their list. UK has introduced the dependent travel ban for non-doctoral level students. Can't bring family members with, to address the issues of net migration. That the data, as we talked about last week, already is showing that there's going to be a huge knock-on effect in the UK for international students come January. Deposits are way down, and enrollments are way down, applications were way down. So in key markets as well, India, Nigeria, that are affected most directly by this dependent travel ban. You see in Australia, there's talk about caps on international student numbers. No one's saying that yet definitively, but there's talk there. There's talk about that in Canada. There's talk about having the net migration numbers in Australia in the next year. So there's some real issues here. And this is the perspective piece that I think it's important for us in the US to have about what our competitors are doing right now. We are in really an opportune moment in our international education life. We are moving towards an international education strategy. We're a couple, 3, 4 decades probably away from getting it. I'm being a little bit pessimistic. But now with the U.S. for Success coalition that has rallied a lot of the association world specifically around the international education piece for immigration reform, for departments to make the kind of structural changes they can to allow for a more streamlined process for international students. But the real challenge is the regulatory piece that requires acts of Congress to change things. That's a much more larger picture. You've heard me talk about the political capital that's going to be needed to be expended from the White House down amongst leaders of Congress to get that done and have a standalone bill rather than put it in with an omnibus bill at the beginning of a cycle that'll never get passed. So there's a focus that's happening in the United States that is not happening around the world. Whether the government in the U.S. is going to be as receptive as we'd like them to be to what we want for international education to move forward in significant numbers in an organized, cohesive way, I don't think we're going to be there yet. The election next year will have a lot to say about what direction we go. But there's hope, at least that amongst those that know in the international ed industry, that the government at least is more willing to listen. So we'll see what happens with that. But because our major competitors, Australia, Canada, UK, are in kind of a not contraction, but at least not unrestricted growth mode, we're now in a position where we can potentially affect some real change if we coordinate our efforts, if we take advantage of how we market ourselves to prospective students in the key markets, India, China, some of the African nations that are coming up, Nigeria, Ghana, Kenya, that are starting to build up momentum in terms of their growth, Indonesia, Vietnam, Korea, Japan even. There are still huge markets for the U.S. Canada is a huge market for the U.S. It's number 4 on our total both in the Open Doors numbers and the See This by the Numbers report. So opportunity exists for us if we have knowledge and awareness of what's going on in the wider world, that perspective piece. So these, what we've talked about here so far, have covered a lot of the three of the P's that we're talking about: perspective, partners, personalization. And that's something that we really think is important for you to identify on your own campuses, is how you can best be taking advantage of what's out there, what the changes are coming in the world, and adapting your strategies to meet the growing needs of students, the different needs of our prospective student populations. Now, our final topic of the day, and just a couple quick minutes on this one, on how will Australia's new migration strategy impact enrollments down under. This is a topic that is gaining a lot of traction because we've covered Canada already a couple of weeks ago. We covered the UK last week. With all the changes that are happening in these major destination markets for international students, we're seeing now in Australia, they have now, as part of their new migration strategy, they have identified the need for a genuine student test. That they're looking at revamping the graduate visa that students get as part of their the post-study work opportunity when they're finished. The migration strategy document, it's not approved yet, but it's certainly it does have a very positive statement of intent that the international education is a new engine of economic growth for Australia and an important part of our social fabric. It's not a new engine. It's been a driver of their growth for a couple decades at least. But they do caveat it with, however, growth in the sector needs to be promoted through integrity and quality, and students and graduates need to be better supported to realize their economic potential in the labor market. Now, I will say I see a lot of similarities with what I'm seeing in Australia with this kind of language about making sure the services are better, focusing on quality, delivery of service from institutions and the institutions themselves. I see a lot of similarities with what's happening in Australia and what's happening in Canada, because that's also one of the driving forces we talked about, and some of the news stories this week mentioned as well, that Canada is also looking at, we've got these puppy mills or diploma mills, as Mark Miller, the Minister for Immigration, Refugees and Citizenship in Canada, pointed out, that he wants to get rid of those diploma mills that are just shortcuts for students to enter the country to get into work opportunities, not actually spend any time or money at the institutions. So, or just spend their money at the institutions that aren't really providing the services. Then that has that knock-on effect we talk about. So similar issues in Australia. The housing issue is huge there, as a huge shortage. There are capacity issues in terms of what's going on in the housing stock that's available. We talked about in the past how during the pandemic, a lot of institutions sold off properties that were off-campus housing for international students that are now gone because they sold them so they didn't have to lay off staff. So it was kind of a Solomon's choice there in terms of what to do. But you see Australia grasping at some of the same issues there, that the post-study work rights are under threat. The savings threshold in terms of what students are going to have to document for Australia to get a student visa are being raised. English language requirements for visa applicants are also being raised. So there's some real limiting factors that will make Australia less popular for international students in terms of the kinds of students that had been attracted, particularly at the vocational level, may not be able to come anymore, and that wouldn't necessarily be a bad thing overall economically. So it may mean a dip in numbers. But you also have those that are much more positive on this, saying that Australia is hurtling towards 1 million international students and recent graduates. So it's very much a positive spin on what's happening down under. But I certainly think there's a lot more that is going to happen in Australia and other countries like this, UK, Canada, that are dependent on election results in the UK next year. It's going to be dependent on how strict the governments are in Australia and Canada in terms of impacting those vocational institutions. So a lot can change. Obviously, international's only constant is change, and that's something I certainly talk about very often, and being aware of that. That's all we have for you this week on the Midweek Roundup. Again, we're going to be taking a break next week for the holidays as we travel to meet with family, but we'll resume in early 2024 and look forward to connecting with you again soon. Thanks, everybody, for making us a part of your weekly international edification, and we wish you the very best moving